Hi, Shadi. Welcome to the Global Conversation.
Hi, Tofi. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. I think we normally meet in person. I don't even know if we've ever done a video call or a video stream. So this is kind of a first for
Yeah, I don't
us.
think so. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm glad to have you here. Definitely want people to know who you are before we go right into it, because I'm sure we're going to have a wide ranging discussion. Shadi, who I've known for many years, I think we first met in Doha, is a political writer of all stripes, a commentator, has been in the think tank scene, worked around the world in the Middle East, has been spending his time in DC. We're always trying to get him out of there, and liberate him a little bit. He's really been at the forefront of so many different issues, written multiple books, including one recently on the case for American power. Has fended off various social media accusations of political stripes, but it always keeps fresh with his views that people can't pigeon him into one box. So, Shadi, welcome. How would you introduce yourself? What would you add to that? What are you doing
Yeah,
now?
sure. So I'm a columnist at the Washington Post, and I'm also a senior fellow at Georgetown University in something called the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. And I'm co-leading an initiative with an evangelical theologian there on the role of religion in public life, with a focus on America. So a lot of my work deals with those kinds of broader questions around meaning, belonging, identity, but I also do a lot on foreign policy and the role of America in the world. And that's the focus of my latest book, as you mentioned, which has the controversial title of The Case for American Power. So I've been busy fending off accusations that I'm a hawkish imperialist, a neo-imperialist, whatever it might be. So I get accused of
Yeah.
all different kinds of things, as you mentioned. You're right about that.
Well, it's an interesting moment because we're about, at the frontier of the 250th anniversary of America's founding and Declaration of Independence, which is a momentous, conversation to have about what is America. But I'm always like also interested in, who is Shadi Hamid? You know, and one of the things a few years ago, I went back to Philly and I hadn't been in a while. And I'm like, oh, Philly's kind of underrated, as a city. And then you're walking around, and I think maybe you get like this. And I'm like, oh, I should really like look at the history. I never take the time to do this. And I get fascinated. And Philly's like the center of so much. So I'm walking around and I run into this house, which has this plaque outside. And it's the house where Thomas Jefferson essentially spent like 10 days and wrote the Declaration of Independence. And that is shaping, 2.5 centuries later, all of our views, our society. If America is this great force in the world, and he sat down and did it in 10 days.
Wow, I didn't know that actually. Yeah, that's pretty
Yeah,
quick.
the first draft. Do you think, I mean, a lot of us in like a policy space, we're spending all this time and writing these books and months, and in 10 days, somebody has like transformative impact. What do you make of that?
That's a really good question. Well, it's humbling. I think that I'm feeling a lot of frustration in my own work and writing that sometimes it feels like you're always hitting a wall, that it's hard to actually influence change, that there are forces beyond our control that dominate our politics. And you can kind of feel powerless. And even for someone like me who has a public profile, who writes for a major newspaper, sometimes I wonder, like, do ideas matter in the end? Or are we just kind of screaming into the void? So it's interesting to kind of look back at people like Thomas Jefferson, and they were able to change the course of history in a very short period of time through their ideas. So that serves sort of as an inspiration, a reminder that ideas do matter.
Hmm.
But I think also we're working in a very different media landscape that makes it hard for our thoughts and our ideas to cut through. And that's just something that we can't really change. That's just the way we're going to live for the rest of our lives. That there's such an oversaturation of takes, of commentary, of opinions, and it's very chaotic. Where 250 years ago, you had a relatively small elite. Most people didn't write. There wasn't Substack. There weren't ways for ordinary people to engage directly in idea formation. So it was
Mm.
reserved for a very small group. So if you were part of that very small group, you were able to have a lot of influence on the public debate.
It's interesting you say that. I think you'll spend some time in New York, and you've been here so many times where I'm based. But in Lower Manhattan, which is now kind of this party place, or like it's all on X, right? Everybody's evaluating the lines in Soho, and the nightlife in West Village. But if you walk around, Lower Manhattan is where a lot of the American Revolution took place. The revolutionaries passed through. A lot of the history of the United States at the very inception started here. And one person who lived essentially down the street in West Village, in what is now converted into some random bar, I'm forgetting the exact address, but it's near Christopher Street, is Thomas Paine's house, where he was living. And Thomas Paine, he wrote Common Sense, right, which became actually the most widely published book of its time, and is still today one of the most widely read, books. Obviously, now it's being overtaken. And it was a pamphlet. It kind of went viral, in his era, and was for common people to support kind of the revolution. I mean, so do you think, like, at that time there was the elite effort, right? The Jeffersons, but you also had like Paine, and the books were the new medium, right? In terms of this pamphlet type of, all these publishing houses were popping up in the United States. What do you make of that? Do you think that reorients how you think about how ideas spread, or you think there's just too many mediums today, not just like the written word?
Yeah, there is something, I think, there's something about pamphleteering that is really appealing to me. Like the idea that people would just sit down, write a short pamphlet, and then circulate it by through word of mouth. People would just hear about it and get excited about it, and things would spread. So in that sense, it's not what happened with Thomas Paine and Common Sense isn't too different from, let's say, going viral on Twitter. um, it's just that there weren't many people like Thomas Paine, and there weren't many pamphlets like Common Sense that went viral to that extent. But it raises this question of how do we capture a moment, and how do we break through the noise? And it takes, I think, a variety of things. It's a mixture of luck and timing and pure talent. And it's hard to have all three of those simultaneously.
Hmm.
But we even see it now that certain things catch fire. I mean, the fact that Zohran Mamdani was starting with less than 1% of the vote in the primary, but then something shifted and he was able to go viral. He was able to capture people's attention. And how that happens is always somewhat mysterious. But when we do witness it, we have to it's kind of awe inspiring and it also should give us hope that no matter how bad things are, there is this sense where good people at the right time can actually make a difference. It's not completely hopeless in that regard. And I think you're seeing that with the rise of so many progressive candidates across the country. Abdul Sayed in Michigan, for example, again, someone who was polling very low in the beginning. But if you're able to, people want something right now. People are hungry for a kind of anti-establishment, a kind of critique of the establishment, but also an affirmative vision. So I think when you have both of those things simultaneously, you're against something, but you're also for something else, and you're able to articulate that in a way that is hopeful to people. That's, I think, the moment that we're in now. People want that.
So let me kind of tie in an awkward, ham-fisted way one Shia Muslim to another, and that's like the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini in the 70s. So different than Mamdani, maybe a darker vision. He went viral with his cassettes, right? So, it's an interesting, we obviously 250 years ago, you have, Paine. We're looking at, Mamdani today. But Khomeini also kind of really in a 2-year span, he had a whole arc, but 77 to 79, his tapes, cassette tapes, were being like circulated, and cassettes were like the new kind of platform, right? They were the new kind of way of virality. So I mean, maybe there's a through line. Shadi is just like the mediums change, but virality is still possible.
Yeah, well, when you bring up Khomeini, I also think about Sayyid Qutb in Egypt. In the 1960s, he wrote a book that is still read to this day. It's kind of famous or infamous, depending on your perspective. It's called Milestones, and it is basically a pamphlet. It's not that long. I think just over 100 pages or so. And this he was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was being severely repressed by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president at the time, the secular nationalist kind of leader of the third world. And there weren't ways to publish things like Milestones. So it was smuggled out of prison and it was just given to people by hand. And it was able to shape a generation and how they viewed the role of Islam in public life. And that's without any kind of real publication support. So even through word of mouth and through kind of these kind of secretive underground cells, something can spread kind of outside the scrutiny of the government, outside the scrutiny of the public, and that can change a country too. And we we can't understand Islamism, political Islam today without understanding the role that that small book played in the 1960s, smuggled out of prison. So I think you're right that there's these things manifest themselves in different ways, but there is a through line that virality has always been there. We think it's something new. And in some ways, it is new and different now. But I think you're really right to remind us hey, there's always been these moments where things really catch fire and spread and change a country. I think what's harder now is that it's harder for one person to change the course of history or to change the course of a country. We have 304 close to 340 million people in this country. There's this kind of cacophony of all these different voices and it's very chaotic. And I just think it's harder for one person to shift things, where someone like Qutb or Khomeini were able, like just through the force of their nature, the force of their personality, and the power of their ideas, whether we like those ideas or not, they were able to. Khomeini was able to cause a revolution. Whether you can have one person who's the leader of a revolution now, I think that's become less likely.
Well, it's interesting because it's, I think you spoke a little bit to this, just what actually goes into influencing, right? Like, is it just the idea? And even in some of these examples, there's a lot of infrastructure, there's patronage networks, there's interests that are at play. Like, even if you go back to Paine, like who financially backstopped that publication? I think it was Ben Franklin who even convinced him to move to the United States from the UK because he was an American at the time, right? Which is also very
Mm.
interesting. And with Khomeini, by the time he's doing that revolution, he's 25 years into this game of kind of opposing the state, ever since the mid 50s, really. And then even if you look today, a lot of things we think are viral, it's like manufactured viral. Some of it is superficial, like you look at the what's that Hawk Tuah girl that was interviewed on the
Mm.
street? I don't know if you remember. And then you see, wait, who's financing her podcast and stuff? So do you think that's, I mean, in a way, maybe that's how it's always been, that it's not just the idea and the man or the woman, but also a collated set of interests, patronage networks, distribution channels, organization, depth of time. And so we see the result, but actually virality always requires these type of things.
Yeah, yeah. I think
Is
that
that true? I mean, maybe that's not true, but I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's worth considering.
yeah, I think that if you look at the podcasts and the kind of the new publications that have sprouted out, I'm thinking about the free press, whatever people think about it. And I have my criticisms that the you need to have backers and donors, I think, in this moment, or you need to have a lot of subscription revenue. And I think that those are interrelated. The more that you have that kind of initial seed support and funding for a media venture, then you're going to be able to build your subscriber base more quickly. And the more subscribers you have, then the more donors and patronage networks will want to support you. So it is this kind of virtuous cycle that sometimes happens. And I think most people are doing podcasts that don't actually have a lot of visibility, and everyone's hoping that they can kind of get that support, that someone notices them. And then we all wish we could have a billionaire who believes in our work or believes in us as an individual to kind of like bankroll the work that we do and the ideas that we put out into the world. Um, but I think if you're able, some people are just better at that. They're able to attract that kind of funding and support because they are in line. I don't feel like a lot of what I do is very germane to billionaires. So it's not like something that I hope for necessarily. But let's say I was running for office as a Muslim. There are there are more groups now of elite Muslim donors that are giving to campaigns and helping young Muslim candidates gain traction in Democratic primaries across the country. And so the rise of these Muslim tech entrepreneurs does have an effect on politics. And that's where you see a kind of alignment. They want to see Muslims gaining more traction, speaking out about Gaza, and making noise in these Democratic primaries. And then there are more young Muslims who want to run. So there is that kind of that combination of supply and demand. And that's why we're seeing this moment of Muslims are in the public eye. They're in democratic politics like never before. And they couldn't do that without that kind of patronage and support.
Why, we're talking about a lot of change movements over time, historical, revolutionary ideas, but your mind keeps going back to Muslims in democratic politics. Why is that? Is it a bias? Is it the population around you, your friends? Like, what is forcing you into that kind of context?
Well, first of all, I'm Muslim myself, and I am a Democrat. In other words, not just a small D Democrat, but I support the Democratic Party as much as I have criticisms of it. I think it sort of sucks in a lot of ways, but I'm excited about the fact that it can change. So when I look at America right now, I think one of the most exciting things we're seeing is that the Democratic Party is being transformed. And that actually proves to people that we're not just stuck. Parties can change. And of course, we saw that with Donald Trump. Donald Trump was able to completely reshape the Republican Party against the wishes of the Republican establishment. But I think for us as Democrats, we never thought that that was possible with our own party.
Mm.
The fact that we've had relatively boring centrists lead the party from John Kerry to Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden to some extent, of course, more left on economics. But we have these people who weren't particularly inspiring, who represented the Democratic establishment, who were uniformly pro Israel. And now we're seeing that chokehold on the party being broken. And I think it's one of the most consequential developments in American politics today, that if we have one out of the two major parties that is actually pro Palestine, that calls out what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East, that actually changes not just our domestic politics, but also our foreign policy potentially. So that to me, but it's just interesting to me as an observer to see how that change is happening. To go, how does a party go from being almost like unquestioningly pro-Israel, where now it's a litmus test. If you're running in a Democratic primary, you have to show your anti-Israel credentials and show that you're on the right side of history on this particular issue.
So if, sometimes, when, I think as we get older, meditating and different things, sometimes I can see myself in the moment, and I look at myself and I can react, and you can emotionally kind of pull yourself, you understand, how you react to certain things. And I think you can manage it over time. So if you were to disembody yourself and you looked at yourself right now, uh, what would you say about Shadi Hamid? Because you just wrote this book on the case for American power. On you're at Georgetown at this. You're doing this fellowship, but then you have a very narrow prism about how you're like talking about it. but the ideas you're talking about are very grandiose, very inclusive, transformative over time. Um, how would you see yourself?
How would I see myself? Well, I think that I've gone through my own transformations over time, that I kind of came of age politically post 9/11, probably like you did as well. 9/11 was central, but also the Iraq War. And I came of age of the left. I was a kind of pseudo-socialist, Noam Chomsky reading activist who was protesting outside of the White House. I was organizing die-ins on campus at Georgetown where I went for undergrad. And I kind of saw America as a font of evil and destruction. I was kind of a blame America first person.
Mm.
I thought America could
That's
do
very
could
interesting. Blame America first versus America first. That's like an interesting.
yeah, right, exactly. But I think over time, I think that I fell in love with America and the idea of America. And as I got older, I became more grateful and more aware of just how special this country was. And I've said this before publicly, and I think it's still true for the most part, that this is the best country in the world to be a Muslim. There's something about being an American Muslim that is very unique in the broader historical sweep. We're also, I think, when you think about a lot of the um, reform-minded approaches to Islam and Islamic interpretation, a lot of that is coming from American Muslim scholars who are reimagining the faith in this particular context of American public life. So I think America is exceptional, and I think it's worth fighting for. And that's why I'm bullish in the medium to long run about America. I think America is aligned with human nature. Our system of government, at least, is aligned with human nature in a way that autocracies aren't. So when we look at China or Russia, and people have been talking about the rise of China forever now, but I think that it misunderstands something so fundamental, that the Chinese system is misaligned with human nature. It We as human beings want to have some say over our destiny. We want to have some control over our own lives. We want to have some influence on who represents us. We don't necessarily want full freedom and full liberty because that can be overwhelming. I don't think we're naturally classical liberals, but I do think we naturally want our lives to be expansive. And we have a kind of anti-authoritarian sensibility. This idea that there's one dear leader that imposes his will on the nation. I think that the reason that doesn't last forever, the reason that most autocracies fall in due time, is because there is something in the human spirit that wants that more expansive life. We don't want to be reduced to subjects or automatons in this kind of dystopian autocratic world. And I think this is where China faces a lot of headwinds, is that it actually it does not enjoy, well, we don't know for sure, but it doesn't in any formal sense enjoy the consent of the governed. And there is something very special about an American system, for all of its faults, but it can self-correct. And that's why, for example, in 2026, later this year for the midterms, or in 2028 for the presidential election, I actually have a significant degree of confidence that there will be a course correction. That's what democracy allows us to do. It allows us to change our minds. And I think
I
we
mean,
as
I,
human
I would
beings,
say course change. I don't know what the correction is about. What is the correction about?
that we made a mistake in voting for Donald Trump a second time around, and people are realizing that he's fallen short in terms of his promises of
I
America
guess
for yeah.
I guess I think it's interesting because you keep going back to this like binary. It's very politically and religiously tribal, right? And so it's like this American idea, but it's very reductionist then to say there's a good version of this idea and it's this tribe and it's my religious tribe that I need to say, are they being taken care of? Can they be Muslim in America? So is America just a management of different political and religious tribes? And that always reminds me of like if we look at the America as grown in 50 states, right, in which you could have Mormons living a lot in the Utah or other things. Like it's not like America was never having tribes of some sort, but is it just evolved now into this country that manages various political and religious tribes, and many of the political tribes themselves are pseudo-religious.
I think there is something religious about our political divides that we almost treat them as if they're theological. The way the Democrats and Republicans talk about each other, they're talking about people who are um like the opposing side is in darkness and they have to be brought to the light. There's almost this kind of eschatological, existential tenor to how we talk about politics, which I think is unfortunate. And
Mm,
I've been very much a proponent of, no matter how much we hate Donald Trump or think that Americans made a mistake in voting for him, that we have to respect democratic outcomes. That Americans voted for Donald Trump twice, whether we like it or not, and they did so for a reason. They had legitimate grievances. So I want to be clear that I do respect where people are coming from, and they had legitimate reasons to vote for Donald Trump, in part because the Democratic Party was so uninspiring. But in terms of how I view America and the American idea, I do think that we're unique in one particular way. We're founded upon a moral mission. We're an ideological state. We're a mission oriented state. Most nation states are normal. They care about their national interests and they want to pursue their national interests, but they're not necessarily interested in promoting a set of ideas or ideals. That is what is unique about the American project. We believe that there is a better way to live. We believe that more freedom is better than less. We believe that maybe not always, but at least some democracy is better than no democracy. And we think that that's not just something that Westerners should enjoy or Americans should enjoy. We think it's something universal. In that sense, we're a universalist nation with a universalist ideology. So I think that's actually part of what ties us together as Americans, is that we believe in something beyond the nation state. And whether we're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or Republicans or Democrats, I think there is something there that we feel. Maybe not as much as we used to. And one thing that I'm trying to push back against is the fact that a lot of progressives and Democrats are losing their pride in America. If you look at the polling on this, there's been a plummeting of that now less and less progressives say that they're proud to be American. I think that's unfortunate. I think we have to be proud of America, even if we think it does bad
what was that?
things.
What was that? There was this project, was it 1619 project or something? I forget who founded that. Is like America didn't start with the revolution in 1776. It started in like 1619.
Yeah, that was Nicole Hannah Jones of the New York
Yeah,
Times, who was one of the main proponents of that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, I mean, obviously, we'll talk a little bit about Gaza, but beyond Gaza and beyond Trump, which I think are the two major forces, I think, ruptures of our time, right? I mean, I think that's why we constantly go back to them. So I'm not pushing back on that. But predating that, that's a project that basically is like you should be ashamed of America from its inception. And I've always felt like, how can you build a nation state on shame?
You can't. That's the
It's not
problem.
possible, right? And by the way, the same thing is happening in other countries, the UK, Canada, like a lot of the countries which then moved to like an idea-based reality, even if they didn't start that way. Some of these Anglo countries, right? You can think Australia, New Zealand, they've had their idea-based thinking replaced by shame-based thinking.
And there's actually a term for this. I discuss it
Really?
in my book. We talk about xenophobia a lot, which is fear of what is other, fear of what is foreign. There's also oikophobia, which is fear of what is home, fear of what is familiar. And I think that we have an oikophobia problem right now in the United States, that
Such a
a
terrible
lot of
sounding word.
young
Nobody should be wanting to be an oikophobic. That
oikophobe,
maybe if you use that
exactly.
a lot, maybe it might reverse the trend.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you do have a lot of young people, a lot of progressives. I also think fellow Arab and Muslim Americans who, because of Gaza and because of their loss of faith in the
Yeah.
American establishment, they're turning against the American idea. And I don't think that's sustainable. I think for this country to survive and prosper, there has to be, you have to love enough people have to love the country.
Right.
And I think that's also effective electorally. If you want to win elections, you don't want people to think that you hate your own country or that you're self-loathing. So I think it's a problem on any number of dimensions. But I think that's also why there was a backlash against woke, because wokeness was telling us to feel bad about who we were and what our country had become, despite the progress our country has made on race. I mean, if you compare the U.S. now to Jim Crow, I mean, it's exponentially better when it comes to
Well,
racial
I'm
justice.
always like, America's racist, and it's been racist, but it's, it's like Animal Farm. Like, everybody's racist, and then every country's founding myth. Like, people love going to Japan. How many TikTok influencers who are very anti-American go to Japan and, like, post nice pictures of a matcha or whatever they're doing? And Japan is basically the most xenophobic country in the world. They're all these like hermetically sealed ethno states.
Yeah, and I think that we don't, because a lot of woke liberals, they don't actually know a lot about the rest of the world. They're very narcissistic about America. They think that America, it's almost like a reverse of American exceptionalism. They believe in American exceptionalism, but almost in
As
the opposite
That's
way.
interesting.
And
Have you
and
written
I
about
think that
that?
I think I've touched on it before. I
That's
think
a
so,
very
yeah.
interesting point, because it's like American exceptional from the liberal perspective, and it's kind of like, you're right, it's exceptionally evil.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's why we as children of immigrants, we actually have a better appreciation of what America is and what America stands for than a lot of white liberals. I find that my white liberal friends, I would even say things at times like, is this especially in the woke period, so 2020 to 2023 or something like that? I would just say unironically, I love America. And I'm comfortable saying that. And they would look at me as if I was crazy, like, wait, Shadi, you love America? Are you really willing to use that word? And one reason I'm willing to use it is because I have seen the alternative. I have lived under authoritarian regimes, obviously with some privilege because I've always been an American citizen. But when you're in a country like Egypt, um, you're like, okay, this is very different. Um, it is a fundamentally different experiential thing to live under an autocratic regime and to feel that you're trapped, to feel that you can't say what you want, that you have to look over your shoulder, that you have to be careful about what you say, and to live in a country where I can say whatever I want and whatever I feel, for the most part, without fear of persecution. That is such a remarkable thing, and you can only realize how lucky you are in that regard if you've spent time abroad in authoritarian settings. You need to have that contrast.
I mean, I think it's interesting because we met in authoritarian settings and in the periphery of the empire, as I call it. And I think I spent much longer out there. I think you returned, and I thought I could make continuing shifts and changes. And I don't call it progressive disillusionment, but you just understand the reality of what's out there, what it takes to change things, and actually where true power lies. And a lot of the periphery is still just responding to the capital of the empire. As much as we want to believe it's got this autonomous drive, you're just really dealing with, to be honest, retrograde forces or influence from the empire. You don't have this extant ideological drive of self awareness, building up a pluralistic ethos in a lot of the periphery of the empire. I just haven't seen it. And if it exists, it quickly migrates out and becomes part of the diaspora.
Yeah, I when you say the periphery of the empire, you're talking about,
Like outside of America, outside of Europe, basically.
yeah.
Like the Middle East. What I call Middle Earth. The term I use is Middle Earth, like from Morocco to India, essentially. People inside the American system, doing some type of transition post colonially, but still really just part of broader Americana universalism.
Yeah, I mean they're part of Americana in the sense that they live under authoritarian regimes that are backed by the US, but I think you're exactly right that when we talk about the pluralistic experimentation that we haven't, like, that's also I think what's great about the US is that it's messy, it's unwieldy, it's fractious, like that's actually in some ways a good thing. You don't want a country that has zero polarization. That's only possible under authoritarian settings where everyone feels a need to conform to one thing. And that's also always what I felt in the Middle East, that the conformist pressures are overwhelming. Where in the US, in some ways, this is exactly the kind of nation we would expect to be, that consensus and unity are fictions. We're never going to have full consensus as Americans because we have fundamental foundational disagreements about the good life. We disagree on what it means to be American, the role of religion in public life, America's role in the world. These are fundamental disagreements, and it's okay to disagree about them. And that's why I feel uncomfortable sometimes when people say, we need more unity, we need more consensus, we need to come together. But actually, how do we come together if we have fundamentally different views? We should honor those differences. Difference is not always a problem to be solved. Difference is good. Where I think that if you look at the periphery of the empire, difference is seen as something to quelch. It's something to destroy. If there's too much difference, they feel too much uncertainty and they want to kind of put that to bed.
Well, I mean, one of the things that you notice is like, so I mean, America is an empire or an imperial force or however we want to term it. It's a hard power entity, right? I mean, the hardest power, right? I mean, the number of nuclear weapons, the force projection, and you can't if you're not autonomous of America. You're part of its security apparatus. To be autonomous of America, you need a hard power apparatus of your own, and then underneath that, you can start having this type of polarization and etc. And the only people who've been able to have breakaway hard power are the ones who obviously did it with this like uniformity, but then it's like China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. Uh, there's no breakaway hard power that's emerged in most of the Muslim world, right? I mean, and I guess the question I would have for you is like, what tends to happen to a lot of, let's say, liberals of the Muslim world is they're like, oh, we want to be pluralistic and democratic and create a movement and a protest. But then you're still under the umbrella of American hard power. You're not creating your own hard power center. And so there seems to be a dissonance. And then they run to the think tanks in London or DC, or, are writing for like different newspapers, start an NGO that's funded by maybe partly State Department, partly some philanthropists, partly some nefarious forces that have their own interests of destroying hard power in those parts of the world. Uh, and so, do you think there's this like the experiment of liberal Muslims out there and pluralistic people in the periphery of the empire? They need to first become authoritarians, autocratics, create hard power, and then underneath that, they can then do all this experimentation.
Well, obviously, I disagree with that. I don't think the path should include any authoritarianism. I don't think that's a path that people have to
Mm.
pass through.
So, how do you achieve
Bef-
hard power? Like, look at what Erdogan is doing right now in Turkey.
well, I don't think that hard power needs to be the top priority of Muslim nations. I mean, Europe lived under, I mean, it still does under America's security umbrella, and that
So
actually
you're saying they
helped.
should accept if they accept American hard power as their umbrella. So sovereignty is not as important as essentially prosperity.
Sovereignty is not as important as democracy. For me, I'm a democracy first person. And in that sense, I might be seen as a little bit reductionist on that. My top priority is Muslim majority countries experiencing some degree of political competition, of pluralism, of political freedom, because I think that there's something.
So can I push on you on one thing just because we started the conversation 250 years ago? If the counterweight to the American revolutionaries or the rebuttal to common sense was, well, you can have representation within the British Parliament, and what is this no taxation without? You have your 13 colonies, and they each have legislatures. What's the issue?
Well, Muslim majority, at least Middle Eastern countries, don't even have that. So they are under the umbrella of the empire, but there is no representation.
But let's
There
say there
is
was.
no
In a lot of African countries, they have like different elections and whatever, and maybe they need to improve. But if they did that, is that really democracy if they ultimately don't have the freedom of their countries?
well, I think that under democracy, you also have the freedom to go your own way a little bit. This is what we saw.
Sorry, just to push you again, right? Like when the Americans decided to do that, right? Let's go to the founding of this major democracy, the one idea nation state. The British pushed back. That's the American Revolution. You write a Declaration of Independence, and you weren't allowed to go your own way. That's when the empire, then the British, today the Americans, stop you. So you have freedom to an extent, democracy to an extent, but if you want to create your own system, you have to be able to be a power separate from the greater power. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, but I wonder if you're bifurcating democracy. And if you look at the American experiment, that's not how the revolutionaries would define democracy. They would say we control our own affairs.
So I think that the way that I see it is this. My ideal of US foreign policy is the US putting pressure on autocratic allies to open up their political systems. Once that happens, you're going to have parties like the Muslim Brotherhood, other Islamist parties that have a more anti-Western foreign policy, and that has to be accommodated. And that's what democracy actually allows. It allows people to have some say over foreign policy. So there will be greater autonomy and greater independence, just like we see whether it's France or Germany, they're still under the US security umbrella in some way, but they still have independent foreign policy. So I don't think there has to be a full separation for countries to find their own way. I think it's possible to be part of the overall empire, but to still have some room for autonomy and independence within that. So they would still be allies with the US. The US would still have leverage over them. There would still be military assistance going to Egypt. We saw this under Mohammed Morsi for that very brief period during the Arab Spring, that he would disagree with America on certain foreign policy issues. He would be more vocal on Palestine. He wouldn't just be a lackey of the US, but he also wasn't going to end the Camp David peace agreement. So there was some deference to US security interests. That's still going to have to stay because the power differential is so large. So even if Middle Eastern countries become more democratic, they still have to respect certain American interests. And that's just the way it's going to be. As long as America is the dominant superpower, it is going to set the terms for what are the red lines on certain issues in the Middle East. I don't think there's any way to kind of avoid that. But my hope is that democracy over time, maybe these countries wouldn't have completely independent foreign policies in the beginning, but they would at least have pluralistic competition. And that's what I think there needs to be: competition between different parties, between different candidates. And that is the first step on this longer path to autonomy and independence. You need to have some kind of competition, even if you're not having the kind of full sovereignty that you're talking about where you go completely your own way.
It's an interesting one because it's like if, you know, you have this type of Western umbrella, and we see the Taliban emerge in Afghanistan. We see Ahmad Jashara in Syria. Um, there seems to be a desire to establish an inherently Islamic or civilizational force under which this competition for ideas can really evolve. Like there is an intermediary step where it goes backwards before it goes forwards. That where there is true inherency of the country over itself, and only within that can it have an honest and full introspection of ideas, debate, engagement to then evolve something, let's say, to another modernity. But as long as that doesn't happen, it's like this weird froth based at the top competition of ideas that's not really engaging the depth of the society. And the depth of society keeps coming back and overriding whatever the froth created.
That's an interesting way of putting it, the froth of it. Part of the problem is we don't really know how this plays out because we haven't allowed democratic experiments to actually run their course in the Middle East. So a lot of this is speculative. We don't know exactly what it would look like. I mean, Egypt was, I think, one of the more important, promising cases. As flawed as the democratic experiment was, there was this kind of discussion of civilizational identity. And I think whenever you have religious parties participating in politics, they're going to put that forward as an ideal. That's what democracy allows. Democracy and political competition means that parties like the Muslim Brotherhood are going to be able to articulate an alternative to Western dominance. They're going to say, like, we have to, there is a kind of civilizational depth that we have to recognize. And that's not always a good thing. You might say, um, maybe that shouldn't be the priority of these countries, that they shouldn't be focusing on a civilizational alternative right now, that that could come maybe later, and it doesn't have to come from parties like the Muslim Brotherhood. But I think that is the first step where you have those ideas being freely discussed, even if they're not fully realized. But I think that's why we have to. My hope is that in the coming decades, we're going to have something, another Arab Spring or something resembling an Arab Spring. And then we can start to see how these countries chart their own course when they have more freedom of maneuver. But we just,
I don't
ch-
even
ch-
know if these countries will have the same borders. I don't even know where these borders come from. Like I see what you're saying, but we're operating on a dynamic where like I go back 50 years, the borders were different. I mean, obviously, it's not like United Arab Republic and Syria and Egypt coming together 58, 61. I mean, like after the Cold War, breakup of Yugoslavia, like the idea that we're going to have the same 193 countries 15 years from now, I don't even buy it. I don't buy these political systems as they exist today. Some of these are rulerships installed by the British. um, so I just wonder what we're even talking about. Sometimes the evolution of the dynamic, I think, will be beyond how me and you have been reared, right, in these constructs. I think the evolution of the next 15 years will be outside the constructs in which we operated in, and will challenge our assumptions. You know, what if two countries combine? What if somebody takes parts of another territory? What if a ruling system collapses? What's holding these countries even together? Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I'm just like thinking out
uh,
of the box here.
yeah, I think that the nation state paradigm is just so dominant right now. I have trouble seeing that alternative for the future. I
Mm.
think that also the U.S. will work against these countries collapsing and being divided up in with new borders. The U.S. has an interest in seeing borders remain as they are. So I think that's
For
one
stability, for, like,
for
preventing
stability.
chaos.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Um, that said, Syria is an interesting case because the Israelis would probably prefer that Syria is more divided and factionalized, and that you have, and
Mm.
even the idea behind the Iran war was that you would have these kinds of insurrections from different ethnic or religious groups, and that would lead to a weakened Iran that was no longer a full nation state. So I think sometimes you can imagine what that would look like. But the fact that the Iranian state is staying pretty strong and the Syrian state is growing in strength under Ahmed Ashara, I think there's something about the moment that we're in where power becomes increasingly centralized and it becomes harder. It's hard to break the hold of authoritarian regimes or authoritarian contexts.
So, but
And
what's
we
the Yeah, go ahead, finish the thought, sorry.
No, and I'm just saying we haven't had much change in borders. If you look at the last 30 years, I mean, since 1989, 1990, early 90s, there hasn't been much change in borders. What I think there was this
You
idea
have
that the
South
nation,
Sudan is one of the biggest countries in the world.
yeah, Sudan being one of the exceptions, but I'm just saying it hasn't been particularly
Yeah, you
common.
haven't seen, like, the Middle East being, like, redrawn, like a Sykes-Picot style kinda type thing, right? Yeah. Uh, it's interesting what you pointed to around the chaos and the borders, and then I think about, like, the American interests. You know, the Moroccans were one of the first, right, to recognize America, establish diplomatic relationships. There's, I think, a consulate that's from 1812 that's there, you know, that was gifted by the monarch at the time. And if you go back to that period and you would read Jefferson or Washington, Alexander Hamilton, anybody. I never saw any of them saying we must make sure these countries are democratic. They said we must have good relationships. They didn't think about the political systems within these countries, stability for sure. Why is democracy an imperative for America? Is that a new imperative? Because it wasn't a founding imperative. And in a world like today, if is that like even if it is an imperative, isn't it a fifth or sixth priority?
I think that's actually the founders believed that more of the world would become democratic. They just didn't believe that the US had to do it through force. They believed that the power of our example could inspire other countries. Um, and
But
there
they
was a
didn't
lot of
run their foreign policy that way, right? So forget their their ideas and aspersions. The foreign policy of America and the presidents at the time, I don't think we'd find an example up to Woodrow Wilson of them saying we must democratize
but
people.
that's because we didn't have the power back then. Only
Okay.
when we become a superpower, start to show signs of becoming a superpower, can we start to actually put those aspirations into
Mm.
practice. So I think that it's very hard now to go. I mean, I think that considering that we are the superpower and we are still for the time being unparalleled in our dominance, I just think that there's no way for us to cordon off our values and beliefs as a country and to just focus inward and not care about what other countries are like. If we have, my view, and this is what I articulate in my book, is that if we have the power to make the world better according to our ideals, we should try to live up to those ideals. And that's why I'm so outspoken about the need to condition our aid to autocratic allies and to make them less autocratic. Because if they're getting $1.4 billion of military assistance every year, we are the senior partner in that relationship and they're the weaker junior partner. We should have demands about what these countries look like. If we believe that democracy is better, we should use our power to promote it. I
But
think we
what if
have a
that counteracts against other American interests? Especially, and you speak about American dominance, which I agree with you, still 25% of the economy. I don't think China, rivals it in the same way. And people always point, oh, but it used to be 40, 50%. That's like during Eisenhower's time. It's a different era. But throughout Pax Americana, actually, it's not changed that much, over the last 30 years. And if you really look at the numbers, right? I think there's a lot of conversation online. There is still China and there is still Russia, right? Like those are still strong powers, and it's not just America operating. And so, there are different concerns to manage. Why is democracy so much more important than preventing chaos, having good economic relationships, stability, counteracting Chinese and Russian interests?
because I think the
Why?
only way we can have medium to long term stability is if nations have the consent of the governed, if there's some public input. When you have authoritarian regimes, they're fundamentally unstable because they're brittle. They're not based on a strong foundation. They're based on coercion and force.
Have
And
you done
I
this type of study outside of Europe? Where are you pointing to? Is it Kenya? Like, which is a democracy that we can point to as stable more than
no, I think that we
another?
can point to authoritarian regimes being unstable. I mean, that
But you
was the
have to give the
lesson.
counter case. You have to give the counter case. I mean, because what are we talking? I mean, I don't. Maybe this study is out there, but what is the counter case? Because it could be Modi's India, but probably you would say Modi's India is not democratic; it's
It is
authoritarian.
no, it is democratic.
Okay,
It has certain
so
there are
so do
some
you think there's a
authority.
hybridity? You could have like authoritarian democracy.
You can have illiberal democracies
Okay.
similar to what Hungary was becoming under Orban,
Mm,
similar to Modi in India. So,
mm.
in other words, countries where there are competitive elections, but there are restrictions when it comes to freedom of expression
Are you
or
comfortable with that?
it's not ideal, but I think it's better than the alternative of just pure authoritarian regimes. I think India is better than the alternative that we see in the Middle East, which is no freedom, no democracy. So India, for all of its faults, is at least somewhat democratic. I think that what democracy allows for is peaceful rotation of government, and that gives a kind of predictability to the future. The problem with authoritarian regimes is that you don't know what happens after the one leader dies. It's so personalistic, it's so dependent on such a small number of people that you don't know what's going to happen. What happens after Sisi passes? What happens, what happens after King Mohammed passes in Morocco? Like, we don't know what that looks like. So what democracy does is it does actually offer a layer of stability. Maybe not in the short term. I think young democracies tend to be unstable and erratic. So I think we have to accept some level of instability at first in order to get to something more stable in the future, because the lesson of the Arab Spring was authoritarian regimes seem stable until they're not, and then it's too late. We thought Egypt was stable under Mubarak. We thought Tunisia was stable under Ben Ali. But then we see uprisings happen in rapid succession. The lesson of the Arab Spring is that these countries are brittle at their core. And if we want to see more stability, we have to think in the long term. Because what has the Middle East produced over the last several decades? It's produced extremism, civil war, um, terrorism. I mean, you name it.
But
The Middle
I will
East.
tell you, there's a lot of great artists. It's interesting, right? Like there's artists, there's now intellects, there's social media influencers, there's music. This weird diaspora pipeline that finds its way from various Middle Eastern countries to the Gulf, into now New York and Brooklyn. There's a real reality of that connective tissue that's unfolding.
So, what do you think that indicates?
I
Say
don't
more
know.
about
I've been
that.
trying to think about it because it's like, it's part of it is modulated by autocracy, stables autocracy that don't allow political expression, but allow media expression, allow business expression and entrepreneurship, uh, has kind of created this pipeline effect for some of these people. And then others, they've entered in the diaspora has become almost like not American, but still living in America, you
Mm.
know? And that creates this kind of weird superimposed diaspora elite who reject the countries where they come from, would be rejected if they were trying to rule them, but still dominate the cultural discourse about them. And I don't know where they belong. And I think it's different than me and you who are like immigrants and sons and daughters of immigrants. There's like this new weird, they're like, I'm not part of America, but I'm diaspora and I benefit from it. I go to the Brooklyn Cafe, I make money. I might go to Dubai for a few years. I might be Mamdani's wife. My parents are still there, but I'm against the UAE. Like, what's going on? But that exists. And that has a huge cultural influence for the conversation. Obviously, I'm hitting at this at the end of our conversation, but I think I still haven't unpacked all of that, but I think that's something happening, and it's hard for me and you to relate to because this is especially with the next generation. They're more like that than us.
Yeah, that's interesting. The next generation won't be as committed to America and won't feel their identity will be a little bit more fluid. They go back and forth. They're maybe more
But they don't even
skeptical.
go back. They go back to an imagined reality that only exists in their mind. Because if they
Yeah,
go back,
right.
I remember when I went back to Libya after the revolution, and these guys came back from Arizona, and they were just like, people were like, you haven't lived here for 20 years. You don't know who we are. And the people, same things happen to people going to Syria. Like some like edges, but like countries move forward and change.
Yeah, I think Syria is really interesting because I do have Syrian, like quite a few Syrian American
Yeah.
friends who have now idealized the new Syria and are now going back and forth and spending more time in Damascus. And that'll it's a fascinating experiment, like what that will
Mm.
actually look like. But I think that that's where Gaza plays an important role. That because God, for some people, Gaza has represented the end of American empire. That this is the end of the American era, and that Gaza shows the way to something new, a kind of post-American future. I think that if that's what the next generation of American Muslims and Arab Americans think, then their identity is going to be more fluid. They're not going to be as American. And I think the post 9/11 generation, a lot of us feel very American and very committed to this country. And I wonder if that's going to be the case with the next generation, because for them, 9/11 wasn't the dominant event. The dominant event was Gaza. And that completely changes one's perspective on things. If Gaza, like if you take Gaza as the breaking point.
It's interesting because I think I mean, I'm also, yeah, I'm evolving. Like, I've spent so many years running away from trying to be part of the empire and America, and now understanding the weight of its power. I think you mentioned and do you try and fight this power in pageantry, or do you try to shape it? I think that's one of the things that people are going to have to wrestle with, right? And you can live in your imagined construct of the splendid isolation of your mind, or you can deal with the reality of the world and try and shape it towards an end, maybe failing along the way, but at least try. And that's, I think, you know the discussion that, if you're not in that discussion, I'm like, what are we even talking about? And that's kind of where I'm finding myself more and more. And there's fewer people, Shadi, who are ready to shape things. They're really ready to have the argument, um, and then be it. And there's enough largesse that's subsidizing a lot of lifestyles, um, and then that's why I think the CCs and whoever, they're all still there, because to dislodge, or in this country, you talked about Trump or others, there's a lot of other, like, bureaucratic industrial complexes. Those don't get displaced from the construct without very, very robust movements, conversations, debates, that's towards an end, right? But if you give up on the end, well, there's not going to be a fight. There's not going to be a change.
Yeah, and that's why my view is that I take American power as a fact that is not going to change anytime soon. And my preference would be to reshape American power, to use it for better ends. And American power has been, I think, stacked against the Middle East for such a long time, and that Arabs and Muslims have been on the receiving end of American power in destructive ways. But I want to imagine a future where American power can be used to open up the Middle East, to actually create better futures for people in the region. Just imagine, what if we actually used our power for things that we were proud of, things that we're proud of? And that's why I go back to the young progressives and the fact that the Democratic Party is changing, because that can actually have a major impact on the rest of the world if we can articulate a new foreign policy, like a progressive case for American power, one that actually like promotes American ideals in a more consistent way. And that's what I think Bernie Sanders promised. If he was going to be president, he wasn't going to give up on American power. The American military would have still been there. We would have probably had more cultural and soft power under Bernie Sanders. He would have inspired more people abroad. That would have been an interesting test of this alternative foreign policy. But we've never really had a progressive president like Bernie Sanders wielding American power in ways that are more aligned with what I consider to be American values. So that would be a really interesting test case.
Well, let me take you to fast forward you to the year 2040. Okay, so it's getting closer, actually, day by day. It's not that far away. How do you see kind of America and its role in the world uh, in 2040? So we're about 14, 15 years from now. If you project forward, what does America look like to you? What is the world with America in it?
I think we're going to bounce back. I think there's still going to be an American century. I think a lot of the predictions of American decline will seem short-sighted in retrospect, because the declinist narrative has been there since the 60s and 70s. Every generation of American intellectuals kind of enters into this self-loathing and self-despair about their own country. But time and time again, it muddles through. It comes out on top. I mean, there was a time when American intellectuals thought the Soviet Union would overtake the US. That was a fashionable view, especially during the decline, like the period of decline in the 1970s. There was a sense that the American era had passed. So I think we have to remember that whenever we feel very pessimistic about the American future, previous generations felt something similar. We're not the first ones to think this. So I think I think that America is still the economic powerhouse. I mean, some of the numbers are incredible. That since 2008, since the great financial recession, that America's overall GDP doubled, while the EU's overall GDP stayed stagnant. And we completely left Europe in the dust when it came to the size of our economy. So I think there's something there that is resilient. I think that China is facing a lot of headwinds, not just because it's an autocracy, but also because its population is shrinking. Its fertility rate is well under replacement, almost half of their replacement rate at around 1.1. Replacement rate is 2.1. And what replacement rate is, it just means that it means the birth rate you need to have to sustain your own population. China can't sustain its own population. It will shrink. And that means its economic vitality will be called into question in a pretty severe way. America has an advantage that even if our population shrinks, we can make up the deficit. How? Through immigration. People still want to be in America. They want to move here. No one really wants to immigrate to China. There is no tradition of becoming Chinese if you're not already Chinese. That, I think, is our cultural superpower, is that we can actually grow and expand where other countries stay still.
So, on that note of movement, let me ask you one final question, but a quick answer. Are you ready?
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Where is Shadi Hamid in 2040?
Oh boy. Um, I mean, I hope I'm married with kids and have like a different kind of like life that is more family
And
oriented.
what
I
city? You gotta, and we're gonna end on it. You gotta give me one city,
I'll
2040. Where is
probably,
Shadi Hamid?
even if I like New York and like the idea of living there, I think that DC is probably a place I'll come back to.
Okay, so
But I'm willing.
DC culture. We're gonna end it there. You're gonna go with your intuitive sense of what came, and we'll discuss it more in person for round two. Shadi, we went so deep in so many directions. Multiple people are gonna be upset with what we said, but you know what? I think I enjoyed the conversation, but it's so complex because each of these themes we could have just gone on for a long time, right? I mean, each of the countries. So, hopefully more people are going to engage on some of these themes over the next coming years. I look forward to our next conversation in person. Really appreciate you doing this, and thank you for joining again to the global
Yeah, likewise,
conversation.
Taufi. Really enjoyed this. Thanks so much for having me.